The morning of November 12th, 2024, didn't arrive with a sunrise in Eldridge, Nebraska. Instead, the sky simply bruised into a heavy, leaden gray that bled cold rain over the rusted corrugated roofs of the Vanguard heavy plant. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the closing of a factory gate for the last time. It isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of an ending. For 60 years, the rhythmic thrum of heavy machinery had been the heartbeat of this town, a steady pulse that told the people of Eldridge that the world still needed what they made. But that morning, the pulse had stopped, the gates were chained, and the auctioneers had moved in like vultures, circling a fallen titan. Among the crowd of liquidators, scrap metal dealers, and somber-faced workers stood Silas Thorne. At 68 years old, Silas was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the very hickory and iron he'd spent his life maintaining. He wore a canvas coat, stained with decades of oil, his hands tucked deep into pockets that had carried every wrench size known to man. He stood apart from the rest, watching the polished shoes of the city men splash through the puddles of his life's work. But the silence was about to be broken by a voice that didn't belong in the mud. Julian Vane, the regional liquidation manager, stepped onto a makeshift podium with a megaphone in one hand and a digital tablet in the other. Julian was 32, wore a suit that cost more than Silas's first house, and possessed the kind of confidence that only comes from never having had to fix something that was truly broken. He looked at the men gathered there not as craftsmen, but as line items on a balance sheet that needed to be erased. Julian's eyes scanned the yard, landing on the small, dilapidated wooden shed tucked behind the main assembly hall. It was a shack that hadn't been on the official floor plan for 20 years, a place where the air smelled of ozone and ancient grease. Julian smirked, turning the megaphone toward the crowd, his voice amplified into a tinny, arrogant rasp. He pointed a marked, manicured finger at the shed and then at Silas, who was leaning against a rusted fence post. He asked Silas if he was the one who had been squatting in that lean-to for the last 2 decades, and the crowd turned to look. Julian didn't wait for an answer. He walked toward the shed, the auctioneers following him like a royal court, and kicked the door open. Inside, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of heavy, blackened lumps of metal. They were starters blown out, burnt-up starter motors from the old iron wheel tractor line. They were piled in crates, stacked on shelves, and heaped in the corners like a graveyard of mechanical failure. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the damp air. He called the crowd over, holding up one of the starters by its greasy casing, letting the black soot smudge his leather gloves. He told the assembly that this was the perfect monument to why the plant was closing. He said that while the world moved toward brushless motors and digital torque sensors, people like Silas were busy hoarding garbage. He called Silas a mechanical hoarder, a myth so stuck in the past that he couldn't distinguish between a spare part and a paperweight. The younger engineers in the crowd, the ones who had been hired in the plant's final, failing years, chuckled under their breath. They saw Silas as a relic, a man who still used a manual micrometer when the world had moved to lasers. The humiliation was clinical. Julian looked Silas in the eye and asked him why he'd wasted the company's space for 20 years, stashing away items that were literally designated as scrap. He didn't wait for Silas to speak, because in Julian's world, the old had nothing to say that the new wanted to hear. He announced to the entire auction block that since the shed wasn't even worth the cost of the inventory labor, he would offer a special minor discount. He looked at Silas and told him he could have the entire contents of the shed, every rusted, blown out, useless piece of copper and steel for exactly $1. Julian pulled a crisp bill from his wallet and tossed it into the mud at Silas's feet, telling him it was a pity prize for a lifetime of loyalty to junk. The crowd laughed, a nervous, jagged sound, as Silas slowly knelt down. His knees creaked like an ungreased hinge as he picked the dollar out of the dirt. He didn't look angry. He didn't look ashamed. He looked like a man who was used to waiting for the weather to change. He tucked the dollar into his breast pocket, nodded once at Julian, and said, "Done." But as Julian walked away, convinced he had just performed a masterclass in corporate dominance, he missed the way Silas's eyes lingered on those blackened motors. You see, What Julian didn't understand, what none of the men in the suits understood, was that Silas Thorne wasn't a hoarder. He was a librarian, and he had been collecting a very specific kind of history. To understand why Silas would pay $1 for 1,000 pounds of trash, you have to go back to 1974, to the day Silas's father took him to the edge of the North Pasture and showed him the first Iron Will 800 tractor the family had ever owned. His father had told him that a machine is only as good as the heart that beats inside it, and in those days, the heart was made of copper, deep, thick, hand-wound copper that could handle a surge of power enough to dim the lights in a farmhouse. Silas grew up in an era where things were built to be rebuilt, not replaced. He had watched as the Vanguard heavy plant slowly shifted its philosophy over the decades. He saw the transition from the over-engineered masterpieces of the 70s to the optimized units of the early 2000s. The engineers began to use thinner wires, cheaper alloys, and plastic housings that would brittle and crack after 5 winters. They called it efficiency, but Silas knew it was just a slow-motion betrayal of the people who bought the machines. Whenever an old Iron Will starter came back to the shop, blown out by a farmer trying to crank an engine in 40 below weather, the company policy was to toss it in the scrap bin and sell the farmer a new, improved model. Silas, however, saw what was happening. He noticed that while the modern starters were lighter and cheaper, they lacked the raw, stubborn endurance of the original designs. He started staying late, long after the whistles blew and the floors were swept. He would pull those blown starters out of the scrap bins. He knew that what the factory called blown was usually just a melted solder joint or a fouled commutator minor wounds on a warrior's body. He began stashing them in the shed, one by one, year after year, to the bosses. It was just junk they didn't have to pay to haul away. But Silas was looking at the internals. These old units contained a high-grade, virgin copper that hadn't been seen in the supply chain for 30 years. They had heavy-duty solenoids that could kick over an engine buried in 3 feet of mud. Silas knew that the old wisdom wasn't about refusing to move forward. It was about knowing which parts of the past were too valuable to leave behind. He had spent 20 years of lunch breaks and midnight shifts meticulously cleaning these units, matching the heavy-duty armatures of the 70s with the refined brush assemblies he'd engineered himself in secret. What Julian Vane saw as a pile of scrap was actually the world's last surviving stockpile of industrial-grade reliability. Silas had lived his life on the land, and he knew something that Julian hadn't learned in business school. The earth doesn't care about your quarterly projections. The Nebraska soil is a hard master, and it eventually breaks everything that isn't built with a soul. Silas lived in a small house on the edge of town, a place where the fences were straight and the machines always ran. He was a man of quiet habits, a man who listened more than he spoke, because the wind and the metal told him everything he needed to know. He knew that the factory's new Apex Series tractors, the ones Julian was so proud of, were built on a foundation of sand. They were fast, they were shiny, and they were clever, but they were fragile. And Silas Thorne was a man who had spent 20 years preparing for the day the cleverness finally ran out. But as the gates of the plant locked for the final time, and the town of Eldridge began to mourn its future, nobody realized that the most important thing the factory ever produced wasn't currently sitting on the auction block. It was sitting in a rotting wooden shed, owned by a man with $1 in his pocket and 20 years of secrets under his fingernails. What happened next would be the part that no one in the valley would ever forget. The winter of 2024 didn't just arrive in Nebraska. It attacked. 2 weeks after the Vanguard plant was stripped of its dignity and the last of the office furniture was hauled away, the sky turned a bruised, metallic purple. A freak atmospheric river collided with a cold front, dropping 3 months of rain in 48 hours, followed by a flash freeze that turned the entire valley into a jagged landscape of ice and rising mud. This was the moment Julian Vane had been waiting for, to prove his brilliance. He had stayed in town to oversee the final Apex fleet rollout, dozens of sleek, state-of-the-art tractors that were supposed to be the future of the region. But as the floodwaters rose toward the livestock pens and the levees began to groan under the pressure. The future began to blink out. The Apex tractors were marvels of engineering, but they had a fatal flaw that Silas had predicted years ago. They were built with integrated environmental sensors, delicate electronic brains that were designed to shut the machine down at the first sign of a catastrophic fault to protect the investment. As the cold moisture seeped into the proprietary wiring harnesses and the ice jammed the external sensors, the tractors simply died. One by one, the digital screens in the cabs turned red, displaying error code 404, service required. But there was no service. The factory was closed. The servers that held the diagnostic software were offline. The farmers stood in the freezing mud, staring at $300,000 machines that were now nothing more than very expensive, very shiny anchors. The panic started at the Miller farm, where 500 head of cattle were trapped in a low-lying pasture that was rapidly becoming a lake. The only way to reach them was to clear the debris-choked drainage canal with the old-style heavy-duty scrapers. There were 20 old iron wheel tractors sitting in barns across the county machines built 40 years ago that didn't have a single computer chip in them. They were mechanical beasts that would run on kerosene and prayer if they had to. There was just one problem. They had been sitting idle for years. Their starter motors, already weakened by decades of hard labor, had finally succumbed to the damp and the cold. When the farmers turned the keys, all they heard was a hollow, heartbreaking click. The copper had finally given up. The valley was paralyzed. The modern machines were too smart to work, and the old machines were too tired to wake up. But while the town scrambled in the dark, a single yellow light burned in the small wooden shed behind the shuttered Vanguard plant. Silas Thorne wasn't watching the news. He didn't need to. He could hear the lack of engines in the air, and that told him everything he needed to know. You see, the secret Silas had kept for 20 years wasn't just that he was saving old parts. It was that he was improving them. In the quiet hours of those long-ago nights, Silas had discovered that the primary failure point of the original iron wheel starters was the heat dissipation in the solenoid. He had spent his life savings, the little he had, on a specific grade of high-conductivity silver solder and a vintage winding machine he'd salvaged from a bankrupt shipyard. Inside that shed, Silas had been performing a kind of mechanical alchemy. He would strip the old, blown starters down to their bare bones. He would discard the cheap, mass-produced components of the later years and replace them with the thick, hand-wound copper armatures he'd harvested from the 70s-era units. But then, he would add his own secret sauce, a custom-machined brush housing that allowed the motor to pull twice the amperage without scorching the internals. He had created a hybrid, the raw strength of the past, refined by the quiet genius of a man who had seen every way a machine could fail. He hadn't just been hoarding junk. He had been building an army of eternal starters. He had 500 of them, boxed and greased, waiting for a day he hoped would never come, but knew was inevitable. The escalation reached its breaking point on a Tuesday morning. The levee at the north end of the valley was starting to weep, and if it breached, the lower half of Eldridge would be under 6 feet of freezing water by nightfall. Julian Vane was in the Emergency Operations Center, his face pale, frantically calling corporate headquarters, only to be told that the technicians were grounded by the weather, and the software override codes couldn't be sent until the satellites cleared. He was surrounded by angry farmers who were watching their livelihoods wash away. It was then that Old Man Miller walked into the room, his coat dripping with sleet. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the sheriff and said, "We don't need codes. We need Silas Thorne." The drive to the shed was a procession of desperation. Julian Vane was forced to ride in the back of a rusted dually truck, his expensive suit ruined, his ego trailing in the mud. When they arrived, Silas was standing outside the shed, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a heavy brass key in the other. He didn't gloat. He didn't even look surprised. Julian stepped forward, his voice trembling partly from the cold and partly from the crushing weight of his own failure. He told Silas that the company would pay anything. He offered to buy back the scrap at 1,000% markup. He talked about strategic partnerships and supply chain recovery, Silas let him talk until the wind died down for a brief second. Then he looked at Julian, really looked at him, and said that the money didn't mean a damn thing to a man who already had everything he needed. He told Julian he wasn't selling anything. Instead, he reached into the shed and pulled out a heavy, blackened unit that gleamed with the ghost of fresh oil. He told the gathered farmers that if they wanted to save their land, they'd have to get their hands dirty. He told Julian that if he wanted a single one of these starters, he would have to be the one to carry them to the trucks. Julian looked at the heavy, 30-pound lumps of iron and copper, then at the mud, then at the silent, judging faces of the men he had mocked just weeks before, with the rain stinging his eyes. The man who had tossed $1 into the mud for junk was forced to drop to his knees and begin hauling that very junk out into the light, one organizing load at a time. It was the heaviest debt he had ever had to pay. The sound that followed was something the people of Eldridge would tell their grandchildren about. It wasn't the polite, muffled hum of a modern engine. It was a violent, earth-shaking roar. In the freezing dark of the Miller pasture, 3 men leaned over the open bay of a 1978 Iron Will tractor, their flashlights cutting through the driving sleet. They had just bolted in one of Silas's eternal starters when the farmer turned the heavy steel key. There was no hesitation. The starter motor didn't just turn the engine, it commanded it to wake up. The high conductive copper and Silas's secret silver solder joints pulled a massive surge of amperage that would have melted a modern unit in seconds. The heavy flywheel spun, the ancient pistons hammered against the cold, and then, with a gout of black smoke that signaled a defiant resurrection, the beast screamed to life, one by one, across the valley. The lights of the old tractors began to flicker on, like a line of weary giants returning to the front lines. It was a mechanical symphony. The sound of 20 Iron Wills idling in unison created a vibration that could be felt in the floorboards of the town's general store, while the $1 million Apex tractors sat like gravestones in the rising water, their digital brains locked in a loop of electronic despair. Silas's junk was moving. The old machines, equipped with the hearts Silas had spent 20 years perfecting, didn't care about sensor errors or satellite connections. They cared about torque. They cared about iron. They waded into the mud, their massive tires churning through the slush, pulling the heavy scrapers and the livestock trailers that the modern world had deemed obsolete. Julian Vane stood on the edge of the North Levee, watching as Silas Thorne walked from machine to machine. Silas wasn't shouting orders. He didn't have a megaphone. He simply placed a hand on the vibrating hoods of the tractors as they passed, like a doctor checking the pulse of a patient he had known for a lifetime. Every time a tractor roared past, it kicked up a spray of cold mud that pelted Julian's ruined suit. The manager looked at his tablet, which was still flashing a connection-failed message, and then he looked at Silas. The power had shifted. The man who had been called a hoarder was now the only reason the town of Eldridge still existed on a map. By the time the sun broke through the clouds the following morning, the levee had been reinforced. The cattle were on high ground, and the floodwaters were beginning to recede. The garbage in Silas's shed had saved $30 million in property and countless lives. When the emergency was over, the silence that returned to the valley felt different. It wasn't the silence of an ending anymore. It was the silence of respect. The Vanguard heavy plant never reopened. The corporate masters in the city decided it was more cost-effective to let the building rot than to admit their new technology had failed the people who needed it most. Julian Vane was gone within 48 hours, recalled to a head office where he was quietly let go, not for being arrogant, but for being wrong. In the corporate world, you can be a shark, but you aren't allowed to be a shark that gets outswum by a man with a dollar bill and a shed full of scrap. He left behind a town that no longer looked at his shiny brochures with anything but pity. As for Silas, he didn't take the 1,000% markup Julian had offered. He didn't open a massive repair franchise or go on the news to boast. He simply went back to his shed. But something had changed. Every Saturday morning, the yard in front of that small wooden shack was filled with trucks. Farmers from 3 counties away didn't come to buy new tractors. They came to bring Silas their old, blown components. They brought him coffee. They brought him stories and they brought him the respect that had been missing from the world for far too long. They realized that the right to repair wasn't just a legal battle. It was a way of life. It was the belief that if you own something, you should understand it, and if you understand it, you have a responsibility to keep it alive. Silas kept that $1 bill Julian had tossed in the mud. He didn't spend it. He framed it and hung it on the wall of his shed, right next to his father's old micrometer. It served as a reminder of a very simple truth that the modern world often forgets in its rush toward the next shiny thing. We are told that newer is always better, that faster is always superior, and that the wisdom of the past is just a weight holding us back. But when the storm comes, and the storm always comes, the only thing that matters is what holds when everything else breaks. The story of the man who stashed blown starters for 20 years wasn't really a story about machinery. It was a story about the soul of work. It was a reminder that you should never laugh at what you don't understand, and you should never mistake silence for ignorance. Sometimes, the man sitting in the back of the room, the one with the grease under his fingernails and the junk in his shed, is the only one who knows how to keep the world turning. In a world of planned obsolescence and disposable dreams, Silas Thorne proved that some things are meant to last, and that the most valuable thing a man can own isn't something he bought, but something he had the patience to save. He kept them all, not because he was a hoarder, but because he knew that one day the world would need to remember how to roar.